As I get older, I realize that time is short, and it's harder and harder for me to spend 2 hours just, wasting time in a movie theater.
And action!
I think stories are very important to the human race. They help us understand how we fit into the scheme of things.
I think the inspiration came to start making films out of the need to tell stories. I mean, I like to think of myself as a storyteller. I think as an actor, I've enjoyed the parts of the stories that I've been allowed to be, contribute to, I guess. But it wasn't a whole, it wasn't complete. It didn't allow me to express myself in all the different areas that I wanted to, which was sound, which was motion, which was light, which was creating something totally alive and new and fresh.
When I was a kid, I used to go to the movies every weekend. We'd go Saturday and Sunday. It cost like 50 cents or 75 cents. And not only was there a double feature, 2 different movies, but there would be anywhere between like 5 and 25 cartoons. So it was a whole day. You'd spend the whole day in the theater. Kids going berserk, jumping out of the balcony, ushers trying to separate you, so, because you're making too much noise, and then you'd have to sneak back to your friends and stuff. It was a whole huge cultural experience. So I loved the movies. I loved going to the movies. But I had no consciousness that movies were written or directed. We only knew the stars on the screen, and I see it with kids today. They think that the actors, make up the words they say. They barely know the difference between the reality and the screen reality.
When I was I remember going to see Psycho as a kid when it was released, going to see Vertigo as a kid when it was released, going to see The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance when it was released. I mean, a lot of the great American directors were still working when I was a kid. Howard Hawks was still working, Huston was still working, John Ford was still working, Hitchcock was still working, and but it was interesting because it wasn't until I hit into my college years that movies became film, became cinema. It was thought of, you weren't thinking, everyone knew who Alfred Hitchcock was because he was on television all the time, but you didn't necessarily, when I was, 12, I didn't necessarily know who John Huston was, although I used to read credits. So, I saw a lot of great pictures that were, in their initial release in the 50s and 60s, before cinema started to become quite so self-aware and understanding that it was an art form and it was cinema, and that these particular directors were not just, manufacturers, but they were indeed artists.
Well, I think I first got the idea or got interested in the subject matter of Los Gusanos when I was a kid, when my mother's parents lived in the Miami area. And so I was seeing what was going on in Miami from the mid-50s, kept visiting every couple of years, saw the exodus of the Cubans and the development of the Cuban community, and really started thinking about, well, what is this? It seems to be this foreign city in our midst, and you would hear about it from the outside, but then started to try to think my way into what it must be to be in exile, what that experience is like as opposed to being an immigrant, as opposed to be somebody who kind of made the decision, oh, I'm going to go to this new place and start a new life, but to suddenly find yourself no longer welcome in the country that you grew up in. And I got interested in how people either assimilate or don't assimilate, how people figure out, okay, what am I going to give up to become part of this new country, or am I going to give it up? Am I going to hold on to the dream of Havana 1959?
I'd say one of the first times I ever understood anything about film was in high school. I wasn't thinking of being a filmmaker, but my best friend at the time wanted to be a filmmaker. And as a result, I would help him with all his films. I would help him with the lighting, with the sound, camera, whatever. And through the study of music and being in the studio, I started to gain more knowledge about mixing and about sound. My brother was a music producer, and so I was always in the studio with my brother whenever he was recording music and stuff like that. And my other brother was a painter, and it was a hobby of mine. So as a kid, mainly, and even in my work as an actor, I would paint what I was thinking or what I was feeling to understand the character. So as a result, it helped me understand composition a little bit more. And I took some classes in school. I started directing theater. So by studying acting, I understood a little bit more about that. And by directing theater professionally, it started to really help me. And then I started to really understand lenses and things like that, I think, more clearly when I started directing music videos for propaganda films. So I started directing music videos, and slowly I built a repertoire of videos and it was an opportunity to really grow, from that. And then, of course, I've been an actor for about 17 years professionally, and I've probably watched some of the best directors in the world work, from Scorsese to, Oliver Stone to Barry Levinson, Altman. I've worked with most of those guys. So, and a lot of the independents like Neil Jordan, well, he's not really independent anymore, or Wayne Wang. So as a result, I've seen a lot of different ways of working as a director, and I'm sure I've learned something from each one of them.
So as I went through my teens, I got more, I started seeing European films and interesting earlier American films that weren't necessarily so popular but had an impact on the future of film. And then that all sort of crystallized in the early 60s when Lawrence of Arabia came out. It was a very impressive movie to us for some reason, my friends and I. Not only was it a great adventure, but we also sensed that there was really great filmmaking involved. Suddenly we were conscious that people made films. David Lean suddenly was a name we could identify. And, if we started looking at movies from that point of view now, who made this film? Suddenly that became a good question, and an important question. I took a lot of theater and speech courses and writing courses in college. We didn't have a film school. But I could just see myself headed that way. I just knew that I wanted to make films someday. And with this new consciousness about filmmakers, I just started looking more carefully at films to see how they were made, how shots went together, how shots were framed, how stories were told, and I just, a lot of this you just pick up, there's a certain amount can't be taught, and you just have to, gather it by observation and by experience.
When I was a kid, I was an only child, and I watched television just like, that's what I did. Continually. I just lived in front of the television. I went to a lot of movies, and little by little I realized that, that's what I wanted to do. I think a very influential picture for me was indeed Mean Streets, Marty's picture, his first theatrical release. He'd done other pictures, and a bunch of us from the South Side went. It was playing up in the northwest suburbs. It was like at the very beginning of the multiplex theaters, and there was like a twoplex, or I think it was a twoplex. And we all went to see Mean Streets because we'd read about it and stuff. And we walked into that theater and we looked like those kids from that movie. I mean, the breaded jackets, the funny little hats, and just little thugs from the South Side of Chicago. And this was like they made a movie about us, about how life was. I mean, it was very similar, the life of those kids and the life of the kids that I grew up with. And it was really a wake-up call that, you could make movies about, it doesn't have to be about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire and, et cetera, that you could make these movies about life on the street and the way it is for the people you know. And it really was an inspirational picture.
I made Thinking in Pictures, the making of Matewan, actually during the editing period of Matewan in the late 80s. And it was an editor named John Sterling came to me and said, would you like to do a screenplay book? And I felt like those were just transcripts of screenplays. And I thought it would be more interesting to write the book I would have liked to have had when I made my first movie. That wasn't necessarily technical, because there's a lot of those books around now, but was about what you should think about before you go and make a movie in all those areas, how you should kind of fill that screen. And the various kind of political and creative aspects of thought before you even pull the trigger on the camera.
I had a series of mentors, starting really in high school. But in college, I had a professor who was very important to me in that he kept reinforcing my writing ability and my acting ability, and he taught the directing course in college, and he just made it seem possible. Suddenly it seemed like, well, you could actually have a career in performing arts. And for me, that hadn't yet shifted to film, because as a technology, film was so remote, and there wasn't even any portable video at the time. So the tools for filmmaking were just a million miles away from us. So to me, performing arts then meant the stage. That was the avenue. But I always knew that could be a stepping stone to a career somehow in movies or television. So I was very conscious when I was performing on stage at Second City that someday someone might walk in, discover me, and give me an opportunity. It turned out that I was discovered from within by John Belushi, who was in the same show, and he got drafted to go to work for the Lampoon in New York, and eventually brought a bunch of Second City people with him. So all those things eventually connected. But my teacher, Herbert Metz at Washington University, very important to me. And then someone got me started as a journalist in Chicago. Richard Christensen with the Chicago Tribune, at the time was with the Daily News. He got me started as a freelance journalist, which got me work as an editor. I was an editor at Playboy magazine before I got in Second City. So these people, it's not that those things directly related to film, but they made me feel that it was possible to take big career steps, from where I was, that I could actually get to where I wanted to be. And then Bernie Sahlins, who produced The Second City, and Matty Simmons, who produced for the Lampoon, they just kept rewarding me and kind of promoting me, moving me forward.
I'd say I'm most influenced by mythic stories. I'm most influenced by traditional myths, and I would say primal religions.
Actually, I was working for my cousin in the south suburban region of Chicago, in a town called Homewood, tending bar in a bar called Lassen's Tap, which belonged to my cousin's family. And I'd been away from Chicago for a number of years, traveling and doing other things besides movie business, and came back to Chicago in order to reestablish myself and get started back on my way to become a filmmaker. So I was working for my cousin to make a living, and this guy was in there this one afternoon who was basically drunk, as far as I can remember, and he was I'd known him, and I was talking to him about the fact that I was trying to leave the bartending profession for the movie business. And he handed me a business card for this company called Maljack, which was a company that was in the south suburban region. And it was two brothers, Walid and Malik Ali, who ran this little business. At the time, at that particular moment, there was no home video. It was about a year before it really started. So these guys were running these Super 8 loop projectors, and they were like leasing them. They used to refer to as bicycling the prints. You take the print from the one source and you take it to the next source, and you keep running everything around in a circle. So, and in order to impress the world that they were like really successful, they bought two big, huge Monte Carlos, Chevrolet Monte Carlos. Those were the biggest cars they could afford for the amount of money they had to spend. And the idea was to make an impression upon the world that they were like, players. And so I would get in one of these Monte Carlos and drive this long route and bicycle these Super 8 prints around during the day, and then at nighttime I was working in the bar. And their business was just starting, and I think by the time I'd left, they were just starting to get into home video. And it was apparent to myself and to Walid and Malik that this was someday going to be a very big business. So they started out with some public domain. They started out buying some titles, and very cheaply at the time, and they started making money. So I hadn't seen them for a few years, and I was working on these little documentary projects. And we were going to do a documentary project on professional wrestling, and we located all this archival footage, all this from the Killer Kowalski and all those sorts of. And the man who was offering to sell the footage, at the last moment, he said, this is how much I want for the footage. But when he found he really had a buyer, he said, oh no, this is how much I want for the footage. And those guys said, you know, we don't like to do business like this, so screw these guys. And in this meeting, when I was sitting with Waleed, he said, well, you know, the hell with these guys. We'll give you $100,000 and we'll make, how about if we'll make a movie like we used to talk about? And we used to, you know, when I was first working for them, bicycling those 8mm prints, it was, someday we'll make a movie, you know. And so they made enough money so that they bankrolled me to the tune of $100,000, and we made Henry.
Basically was writing short stories while I was working in factories and hospitals and things like that and sending them away. And eventually one of my short stories was noticed by a magazine who also had a publishing arm, and an editor there said, why don't you make this short story into a novel? And I said, sure. And that led to me, you know, getting some work as a fiction writer. And as I sold my second novel, I had to get an agent, and that agent had a contact with a film agent, and I had always wanted to work in movies. So I called the film agent up and said, you're representing my book as a property. And they basically said, come on out and show us an example of your work and live out on the West Coast for a couple of years and we'll try to get you work. And that led to me working for Roger Corman, rewriting movies like Piranha and Battle Beyond the Stars. And you know, eventually with the money that I made as a screenwriter, I was able to start my career as a director.
I got started in the business because when I was in school, I was studying opera. And I auditioned for an opera that was playing at the Orpheum, and I got a role in that. And from that, some agents came and saw this opera and asked me if I would audition for film roles. And shortly after that, I started working professionally while I was in conservatory. Because originally, I guess my original focus was just music. I was just obsessed with this idea that I wanted to do it well, because it's something I chose to do for that moment. You know, I wasn't even sure I was going to continue to do it. I made a choice, and I thought I could express myself better than I was in opera, and I just started to work. And as I kept working, I kept trying to get better and better, and that was my goal, to feel comfortable with what I was doing, until I knew what I wanted to do with my life.
I actually got my start as in the film business as a writer. I'd already been performing in cabaret comedy, improvisational comedy at the Second City, and then in New York. And our show in New York was for the National Lampoon, and it featured Gilda Radner and John Belushi, Bill Murray, me, and Brian Murray, Bill's older brother, who's an old friend of mine. And that show was produced by Ivan Reitman, who at the time was producing exploitation films in Canada and always wanted to do a National Lampoon comedy film. So he asked me to write a treatment for a comedy, and I thought I would exploit my college experience, so I wrote a treatment called Freshman Year about my college experience and life in a fraternity in the 60s. And then I hooked up with two writers from the Lampoon, Chris Miller and Doug Kenny, and that treatment turned into Animal House. So you know, my very first professional screenplay turned out to be the most successful comedy ever, so it kind of, the door just blew wide open for me in Hollywood. And I never had a moment after that where I wasn't like fully employed or, you know, even besieged with writing work. And then Ivan Reitman knew me as an actor from my stage work, and when he decided to direct the movie Stripes, he asked me to co-star in it with Bill Murray. So I didn't have to. I screen tested for Columbia Pictures. They didn't know me. They asked Ivan to do a screen test, and they saw my screen test, and they still didn't want me. And Ivan said, you know, forget it, I don't care, I'm hiring him, and he did, and that worked out well. And then Ivan used me again in Ghostbusters. So I've never thought I had much of an acting career. Really, it was writing, and then using writing to get an opportunity to direct a film that was my real focus.
My first movie was Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. I'd worked and done some advertising work here in Chicago, done a number of other things besides the movie business. You know, making a picture on $100,000 isn't that easy. You've done it, so it's probably much more difficult now than it was then, because certainly $100,000 doesn't go nearly so far. But you know, I probably have, if now someone told me, you know, one of the great things was ignorance was indeed bliss at that time, because we didn't never having made a feature film, I had no idea how far $100,000 seemed like plenty of money. A lot, you know, we knew we couldn't do special effects, and you know, we were limited, but it seemed enough to get the job done. And indeed, we did bring the picture in for about $101,000. I was getting, let's see, somehow after a long time, it got shown in a couple places. Then there was some interest. Then I got an agent, and I used to get sent a lot of scripts, bad horror film scripts, mostly, that I wasn't interested in doing. And I remember once or twice I'd heard through somewhere that Marty's company had got the rights to Jim Thompson's book, The Grifters, and I had read most of Jim Thompson's books. And so I thought, well, geez, you know, I'm going to be looking for a director. I called my agent. I said, why don't you see what... Well, as it happened, he sent a cassette of Henry to Marty's company, and his assistant, whoever it was at that time, saw it and just hated it and refused to show it to him. And that's as far as it got. And Stephen Frears made The Grifters and made a pretty damn good picture, I think, out of it. But anyway, it was a couple years later, and Marty had a new assistant, fortunately for me. Her name was Melanie Friesen. And somehow she'd seen Henry somewhere. And she just really loved it. And she called and got a cassette and gave it to Marty. And all this unbeknownst to me, you know. And one day the telephone rang, and it was Melanie, who I didn't know at the time. I know she's become a friend since. And she goes, "Is John McNaughton?" Yeah. And she goes, "Well, this is Melanie Friesen. I work for Marty Scorsese. And, you know, blah, blah, blah. He's seen your film. Henry really liked it. He's going to be calling you in about 10 minutes. And it was one of those things, yeah, okay, fine. Who is this really? You know, no. So, you know, I said, okay, I'm here. And Marty called and blah, blah, blah. We talked about various projects. And I sent him some scripts I'd been kicking around. And he sent me Mad Dog and Glory. And it's interesting because it was often the case where, you know, people would see the picture and they were in the business of, and they would say, well, what are you interested in doing next? And I'd say, well, I have these scripts, and I'd send them to them. They go, oh yeah, well, we're not interested in that. But we got this script we'd like you to read. And you'd read it, and it was just some horrid thing. And, you know, I mean, I really needed the work. I really needed to make a living because I was not making any money whatsoever. And this had happened a number of times, and you're like, you know, really thinking, here it is, you know, another movie, and you read the script and you just go, I can't, it's just too awful. So Marty says, well, I'm going to send you this script by Richard Price, and I wasn't really familiar with Richard's work up to that point, although I'd fairly recently seen the Al Pacino Sea of Love, and I walked in after the credits. And by the end of the picture, I go, whoever wrote this is really a good writer, and it was Richard. So he sent me Mad Dog and Glory, and I read page 1, I read page 2, and it was like a real writer, you know, real writing. I mean, so it was just like, yeah, I'll do this one. And then I was working with Marty and Bob and that whole gang, and it was just like, well, I starved for long enough, and I got to, you know, so I'm not going to, like, you know, this is life. I mean, it's great, but I'm not going to, like, freak out over it. I'm just going to try and do the job.
When Animal House started screening for people in the industry, they had a screening at the Directors Guild Theater. And the word had gotten out that the movie was testing really great in the market research screenings and everything. So various producers either showed up at the screenings or sent representatives to the screenings. And we came out of that screening, and someone was waiting for us, a guy named Don McDonald, who worked for John Peters. John had made this transition from a world-class hairdresser to a big-time movie producer. He had a relationship with Barbra Streisand, and he was just starting to produce big movies. I think he did Oliver Stone's first feature around that time, a movie called The Hand. And he'd done What's Up, Doc, I guess, with Ryan O'Neal and Barbara. And so he sent this guy to talk to us, and this guy set up a meeting for Doug Kenny and I and John. And Doug, we both pitched different ideas. Doug pitched an idea for a comedy set in Tibet when the Red Chinese were attacking the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, and it was kind of a psychedelic war picture. The Tibetan lamas fought back with flaming prayer wheels they conjured up out of the sky, and it was kind of an acid trip fantasy comedy adventure movie. But John was just baffled by that one. And I had an idea for, at the time, the American Nazi Party was going to march in Skokie, Illinois, which was maybe the largest Jewish suburb in America. And people were so stirred up by this idea in Chicago that the Jewish Defense League was training young Jews to fight the Nazis, and the Nazis were getting terrified because they thought the Israeli terrorists were going to come in and wipe them out when they marched. And national FBI was coming into, everyone was coming into Chicago. Police were upset. The whole community was in turmoil. So I thought this would make a very good dark comedy, real good dark social comedy about race in America. And John liked that idea, so he told it to an executive, Mike Medavoy at Orion Pictures, and John told me that Mike really liked the idea, and I went in for this meeting, and I told the idea again, and Mike said, well, I think, it's so controversial, if one bomb threat on a movie theater and we'd have to shut the movie down the whole country, he said you could never play. So as much as I like it, I really, we can't produce this movie. So John Peters jumps up, I thought this was a reasonable response. John Peters jumps up like he's so, offended beyond belief. He said, I can't believe you dragged this man in here, and, you told me this was a deal, and now you embarrass me in front of this man. I can't do business this way. And he storms out of the room, leaving me alone with the president of the studio, who I've never, I don't know the guy. And we're both looking like, what just happened? And neither of us understood it, So he said to me very reasonably, he said, look, if you want to write and direct something, make sure that it's, commercial. Make it urban and contemporary, because I had also pitched a kind of a revisionist Western, an American Western. And so a couple weeks went by, and Brian Murray, my old friend, and Doug Kenny started talking about doing a movie based on their country club experiences. Brian had been a golf caddy, and Doug had worked in a pro shop as a tennis pro. And I had had no experience in country clubs. I was a Jewish kid, always excluded from country clubs. But it was, as a social satire, it was a world that I thought was a good target. So they wanted to do this movie, and I said, well, all right, let's write it together. Doug could produce it, and I would direct it, and Brian could act in it. So I went back to Orion and said, how about this one? And they said, yeah, that's exactly the kind of movie we think you should be doing. So we wrote a script for Caddyshack, and I told John Peters I wanted to direct it, and I remember I was wearing a safari jacket, which at the time was a good outfit for a director, a lot of pockets. And John looked at me and he said, yeah, you look like a director. So that was it, done deal. The jacket and the glasses, I think, is what did it. So we wrote it, and everything was contingent, of course, on them liking the script, and then it was contingent on signing a movie star. We got Chevy Chase involved, Rodney Dangerfield, Ted Knight, and then Bill Murray came in. So it was like a great cast, and it was just clear sailing after that. It was a lot of fun to do, and of course it was a moderately successful movie. So suddenly I had a directing career.
Well, Return of the Secaucus 7 was actually something that I wrote in a very short period of time, but it was unusual in that it was a movie that I had the budget before I had the movie. I knew that I had about $40,000 together from writing movies for Roger Corman in one place at one time. And I figured, well, here's my chance to make a movie, and I started thinking, well, what can I do well for $40,000, $60,000? And I thought, well, most of the people I know who aren't in the Screen Actors Guild yet, who are good actors, are turning 30, so maybe I'll make a movie about turning 30. And then I started thinking about how limited we were going to be technically, that we wouldn't, in fact, be able to move the camera very much. And I thought of Robert Altman's Nashville and how he could always cut to a different character because he had such a big cast. And so I decided it's going to be a movie about a lot of people turning 30. And it just kind of evolved from there, and then I started thinking about people's lives who I knew. But it was definitely on-the-job training. None of the actors had been in a movie before, none of the crew had shot a feature before. I hadn't looked through a movie camera before, and we kind of stumbled through it together. We had, on Secaucus 7, we had 25 shooting days, which wasn't too bad, but a lot of that was that because everybody was a year or two before they got into a union. We were paying the actors what they were getting in summer stock before we hired them, which was $80 a week plus room and board. We were putting everybody up in a ski lodge that we also used for most of the sets. So we were paying about $1 a night per head for housing. And we were able to feed people very cheaply because we were up in the country and there were a lot of fruit stands and vegetable stands around. So it really was a very kind of labor-intensive experience, which was good in that everybody got to learn a lot, rather than a more technological experience where you're kind of off there guarding equipment and you don't know what they're doing back on the set.
The first film that I directed was called Strapped. It was for HBO. And there was an executive there named Brian Cibarella, and he had sent me a number of pieces through the years, but I wasn't prepared to direct yet, at least not a film. And finally he sent me this script called Strapped. And at the time it was centered around the police officer, and I asked him if it was possible for me to change the focus and talk about the kids. It was about kids with guns, but from the police officer's point of view, and I wanted to make it from the kids' point of view. And he told me that would work out for them, and that's what intrigued me and made me want to do that story, because I wanted people to understand the life of the people that have to do this or choose to do this, you know.
There was a time in the 60s when independent films were thought of as art films, and there were theaters we called art houses, and they showed the movies that you couldn't see in your neighborhood theater. The films that weren't big Hollywood releases, films that had more specialized interest, a lot of foreign films, and kind of offbeat films that seemed to come out of New York. And now we say independent film. I read a really good definition of an independent film, and I actually forgot who said it. But he said that Hollywood films are films that confirm the popular view of reality. And the popular view is not always an accurate view. These are happy ending movies. They're movies where justice always prevails. And that's the Hollywood ending. The guy gets the girl, you know, the right people end up together, the bad guy gets punished, the good guy succeeds. And Hollywood films tend to confirm that very simplistic and almost childish view of things. Independent films are films that challenge our view of the world, that they may be unsettling, they may cause uncomfortable feelings of indignation or despair even, you know, may raise real fears in us, you know, and that's not always a commercial thing to do, to unsettle the audience. Audiences like to be excited, but like on a roller coaster, you want the ride to end. You don't want to get off the roller coaster and still be trembling. And when you see a good independent film or a really artfully made film that really has literary value, it challenges everything you think and feel about the world. It forces you to confront and deal with realities that may not be so comfortable. And I think those are the kind of movies that studios tend not to do, which is why those kinds of films usually have to find independent financing, and that's why we call them independent films.
I would say that Henry was an independent film. It was made outside the established financial distribution organizations that normally make motion pictures. The term independent is very, it's sort of like, it's film's equivalent of the word alternative as it applies to music. It sort of was a term that just like when people like Cassavetes made little pictures that were independently financed. They weren't financed by the studios, by the people that were in business at the time to make motion pictures. There were these sort of renegade directors like Cassavetes and others that made little films that were completely different than what the mainstream product being made in Hollywood. And around them sort of grew up, you know, this mythology of the independent, the rebel, the maverick. And as David Mamet sort of refers to in the play Speed the Plow, there are no mavericks. We're all out there trying to grab some money from somebody who's going to give it to us to make films, and those are mostly companies that make, you know, that, for instance, October Films, you know, started, it was an independent company, and then it was bought by Universal. Universal sold it to Barry Diller's USA Network, and now it's been merged with Gramercy and somebody else to make USA Films. I think they were basically the last independent company in the United States that I know of. Maybe the Shooting Gallery is independent, but eventually, you know, it's a corporation's nation. And, it's their nature to absorb smaller corporations that are in the same business, and it becomes, you know, it has become profitable for the large studios to absorb the small studios because they make different kinds of movies that we used to refer to as independent. But There's very little in America today that is independent.
I guess I don't see the lines as easy as everybody else, you know. The only things I guess as an artist is, for me, is lack of money or, I mean, because the lines of independent film are so, when I first started doing independent films, it was a lot different. Now everybody's doing them, the money's different, every studio has their own independent division. How independent if it's an independent division within a studio? Is it really, you know? Any actor can do an independent film now, and they can still call it an independent film even if the budget's up to $30 million. I don't know how that is, you know. Before it was, you know, when I did The Crying Game, they didn't have any money. You know, nobody would do the film here in the United States. You know, Steve Woolley was there and he didn't have enough money to shoot. He'd go to his theater, get the proceeds and come back so they could shoot the next day. That was an independent film, you know. Now it's a different line, you know.
I think that one of the things we're lucky about in this country is that it's a big enough country and a wealthy enough country that even if you attract a very small percentage of the moviegoers in the country, you can still pay back investors $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million, something around that level. So, you know, unlike people in Great Britain where, you know, if they make a $2 million movie, they better be able to export it if they're not going to get the mass audience into it. It's possible for independent filmmakers, if they keep the low budgets and are efficient movie makers, to get the word out there, to get their films made and sometimes to get them on a screen.
Part of the equation of the money is there's a sort of militaristic, not aspect to filmmaking, but sort of, you know, maybe it is an aspect. It's about controlling territory to some degree. I mean, the more territory you can control, the bigger your picture is going to look, you know, because you can shoot, I mean, if you're going to shoot a wide, you know, like a panorama of a mile of territory in this world, you've got to, and if it's supposed to be in 1946, for instance, there better not be any TV antennas, there better not be any automobiles that are newer than 1946, better not be any people dressed in clothes newer than 1946. So if you're shooting in 1946, you can shoot in a forest and be okay, but you can't shoot in New York without spending a lot of money. You know, you have to make it look like 1946. So again, it depends on your story. In the case of Bill Veeck, it's all in period. It's from this story is from perhaps 1946 to 1960. And it's baseball stadiums. So now you're talking about thousands and thousands of extras in period costumes. You've got to have some money. Henry, on the other hand, you know, it was contemporary. It was, you don't have to dress out locations really to any large degree. So you can do it very cheaply. I think it depends on the story. This little documentary I made with George Condo was, you know, shot for next to nothing. And I haven't had more fun shooting a movie, I don't think, ever. And it was a crew of 2 and 3 and 4 people often. So it depends. I mean, the thing with making Henry, people have always said, well, why can't you just go out and make Henry, you know, make a picture like Henry again? It's like, well, you know, all the people that worked on that picture weren't making a living working on it. You know, they weren't paying the rent from working on that picture. They weren't making their car payment from working on that picture. You can't, you know, I mean, you can do it once, and maybe you can do it twice, and maybe once you get to where you can make a living some other way, you can do it in your spare time. But I think, you know, we all want to grow in our careers, and I like working both ways. I had a tremendous time making Wild Things for $30 million, and I had a tremendous time making Condo Painting for, you know, here's $100, well, give me 10 more tapes out of your back pocket, you know, and it was fun. So it depends, but also we like to grow and we like to not always be poor, you know, so.
Well, I won't say that money is the bottom line measure of success always. I mean, obviously everyone wants to make good movies, whether they're financially successful or not, but there isn't a producer in the world who isn't hoping that his films are at least marginally profitable. So when you look at the marketplace, you know, you can release a small character-driven independent film or even a small character-driven studio film into this vast marketplace with a very diverse audience, people of all ages, all ethnicities, races, and religions. And it's a kind of a miracle when a small film does catch on and finds a large audience. But it's all relative, because a large audience for an independent film is often really a relatively small audience for a big Hollywood production. A good case in point is Analyze This film. My most recent film passed Shakespeare in Love pretty quickly, actually. And Shakespeare in Love had been out there for months and months and had already won the Academy Award for Best Picture. But we had no trouble, sailing kind of right past that movie. And of course, that doesn't mean it's a better movie, because more people will see it. So there is a market, as long as the costs are kept in control for smaller films or independent films. There's always the potential for profit, and sometimes much greater potential for profit. You make a movie that costs $5 million, and if you can gross 40, you're doing great. You make a movie for 40 and gross 40, and you look like a fool, So, it's when you look back on your own career, however, and certainly when history looks back, it won't just be, your success won't be measured by how many people went to see these movies. I mean, the movies that really endure for us are the ones that make unique and interesting statements about life, or show us incredibly, interesting performances by great actors, or show us great screenwriting, and hopefully the combination of all three. I was in an Italian restaurant in New York recently, and Analyze This was still in the theaters and pretty popular, and a guy who could have been right out of any of the New York mafia families came up to me, got me around the neck. He said, "Harold, I saw Analyze This 5 times." He says, great movie, great movie." He said, "Shakespeare in Love sucked." So, that he might be more typical of the general audience, than not. But it's not everyone is a critic, unfortunately, but they're not all good critics.
Well, I think I definitely know if you do it in a studio film that there are going to be people who are going to have large concerns, because there's large amounts of money being spent, But it's really a personality issue. I mean, if your producers, when you're doing an independent film, have a very hands-on approach and are not allowing the filmmaker to create, it can be just as stifling or even more stifling than if you're in a studio system. It depends. I've been lucky. I mean, the projects that I've done, the studio in the end let me do what I wanted to do. The process of getting to that is very difficult. The process of trying to understand the balance of the relationships inside the studio system, from the executive to the producers to the president of the studio, to even at times, the head of the studio, who comes in sporadically maybe to watch one screening or two, and I think I was lucky in that my first film did so well, and so the studio felt a little more comfortable in the second. But there's always always issues of as you're trying to create, because people don't always see your vision the way you want. It's really about communication sometimes, and then it becomes about numbers when you start to test the film. I think that's a process that the independent film market doesn't go through as much. And maybe in that way, it may feel safer for them to have or keep their independent vision. It's harder when you have numbers that say you should cut out these scenes, or change the ending, or the beginning's wrong, or I hate this character. It becomes more difficult.
Unless you're making a truly independent film, where you've raised the money outside of the standard corridors. New Line is not going to just let you make your film any way you want. Miramax is not going to give you creative freedom. Anybody who thinks so is foolish. In fact, in many cases, it's worse in the independents than it is at the studios. I guess Wild Things could be considered an independent picture because it was made for Mandalay, which is not a studio. It's an independent production company, but it was made within the studio system. And, it was not we had certainly our disagreements, but we worked them out. I don't feel the film was damaged by by the studio in any way. I just worked for HBO, And although we got into a couple of headbutts on this Lansky project, in the end they were pretty gracious, I must say. And I'm proud of the picture, and it doesn't really represent any major damage caused by the executives.
I think to a certain extent the commercial marketplace, the money feeds on itself. And so if you look at a $50 million movie, there's probably 20 million of that 50 million that really was needed to get it on the screen. And the other 30 million is because everybody says, oh, they're giving out money here and this guy was getting 4 million to star in it or 10 million to star in it. Why should I take scale? You know, it's a speculative, the industry part of it, the commercial part of it is a, speculative enterprise. Like any speculative enterprise, sometimes throwing money at it actually does work.
There's an idea that is definitely an independent film kind of idea that I've been nursing for more than 20 years. It's a biographical film about Emma Goldman, who was one of the great radical political figures of our century. Probably the most disturbing radical female character in America's history almost. She was very nearly convicted of the McKinley assassination. She was implicated in an assassination attempt on Henry Clay Frick, who ran the Carnegie Steel Company. She was arrested and deported for counseling draft resistance in the First World War, which was very unpopular. She preached birth control. She preached free love, an end to marriage, the 8-hour workday. Just too radical. And she was deported to Russia, where she was too radical for Lenin. Lenin kicked her out of Russia because she was too irritating somehow. So she's a great character, but of course studios do not want, she's an anarchist. No, studios do not want to make films about anarchists. First time I submitted it to a studio, I got a rejection letter that said, these people may be your heroes, but they're certainly not ours. So, but over the years I've kept this thing alive. I've even had drafts of screenplays written. I pitched it at Disney, which was like the most bizarre kind of pitch meeting you could imagine. So this is a very radical idea. And I remember once I called Handmade Films. George Harrison, the former Beatle, had a company with a man named Dennis O'Brien, who I think funded most of their projects, at least the development. And they'd done some pretty interesting small films, and I thought, well, yeah, these guys are hip enough to get this and political enough. And so I called Dennis O'Brien's office, cold. I didn't know him, and his assistant recognized my name, put me on the line immediately with Dennis. I was thinking, oh yeah, cool, this is cool. Dennis O'Brien's going to talk to me. And I started telling him, he says, well, yeah, Harold, what do you got? And I started telling him my idea about Emma Goldman. I could just hear his face kind of falling and his, okay. And he said, well, frankly, I was hoping you had something more like Ghostbusters. So here's a serious independent film company. And like everyone else, they're hoping for some kind of blockbuster idea that they can use to fund, lots of small films. Money's hard to come by. Ideas, I won't say ideas are easy to come by, but there are a lot of great ideas around for films. When I want to be inspired, I just pick up a history book. You read the history of any country or any period, and you will find movie stories, I remember I picked up a book called The People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn, and I was amazed to find that there were not one but 2 slave mutinies on ships. One, the Amistad, which got made into a serious film by Steven Spielberg, and another called Creole, which I thought was actually a more interesting story. So before I ever heard about Steven Spielberg and Amistad, I started developing this idea for a movie about a slave mutiny on the Creole. And then found out, when I was finally ready to try to launch this idea, that not only was, it written, but, it was going to get made by Spielberg, which is pretty daunting to go up against that. So I'm saying there are plenty of great ideas, both fictional and historical, but not a lot of money. It's very hard to raise money to make movies. That becomes like the real challenge for the filmmaker is to, how do you find, the needle in the haystack? How do you find that one producer somewhere, who can raise the $2, $3, $8, $10, $15 million, however, whatever you need. We can't all go to Miramax to get these films made. And I've always taken the easy way out. My ideas tend to be much more accessible and a lot broader in a certain way, and tend to have big audience appeal, because part of my intent is to try to reach everybody with, you know, those very corny American kinds of movies that I grew up on, that I still seem to want to make. So studios, you know, continue to fund what I do. I haven't had to, with the exception of Edmund Goldman, I haven't had to go out and like shop these ideas to independent producers.
I think if you tell a good story, then people will see it. Obviously, there's a lot more avenues for independent films because there's a lot more festivals and a lot more markets for people to look at. And then if you really understand the marketplace and you understand that there's a need on the cable market, the video market, the overseas market, then you have a lot more opportunities. It's just that I don't think those are the thoughts that are going through independent filmmakers' minds as to all the different arenas that they really can pursue. Because there's a large pool that needs to be filled for films, you know.
I've had better experiences working with the studios than I have with the independents, I must say. The independent companies tend to disappear overnight. Your films, again, October Films I made a little picture. October Films picked it up. They had plans to distribute it. Now they've been bought. I made a film for a company called Atlantic Releasing, The Borrower, my second film. The company went bankrupt. There was just more, the management there. There was a particular individual who was a psychotic who was running who was head of production. It was a really difficult man to work for. The company went bankrupt. The producer tried to seize the film because he was, he's a creep. He was a bad man who's still working in Los Angeles. We then brought the picture to Chicago. The completion bond company, tried to not pay people who were working to finish the film. The film was hardly released. The next picture I made after that was Eric Bogosian's Sex, Drugs, Rock and Roll. Actually, that company was Cary Brokaw's company, Avenue Pictures, and I liked working for Cary and was treated very well by Cary. Unfortunately, that company went out of business, and the picture was hardly released. I made another picture for Fine Line called Normal Life for a very low budget, and they decided not to release it. All the work that went into that picture by so many dedicated people, from top to bottom, including the actors and the crew, and it was just this little decision by Ruth Vitale and Mitch Goldman that they weren't going to release the film because personally they didn't care for it. It was tremendously frustrating. But when I made Mad Dog and Glory, Universal released the picture. When I made Wild Things, Sony got behind that picture and did a good job releasing it. The studios are going to be there, next year. Almost for sure. That the more they spend on your picture, the more that they're going to promote it because they have to get their money back. And they've been in the business for a long time. They're in the business of producing and distributing motion pictures, so they understand it. But you get to a point where you feel you've been doing this for a while and that you're pretty good at it and that you want people, I don't do this to watch it myself. When I'm done with the film, I don't watch it anymore. It's to be seen by a public, by an audience, and you want it distributed and you want it seen. And I find that working with the studios is, in that respect, is more rewarding often than working with the independents.
Well, I was an actor actually before I was a fiction writer, and then I was a fiction writer before I was a movie maker. But I really don't want to be an actor for a living. It's a terrible job. You have to wait for people to tap you on the shoulder and say, come along. And half the time, it's for a movie that you wouldn't see if you weren't in it. So far, the movies that I'm writing in the screenplay stage, there's no parts for me. But I assume sooner or later there'll be something else that I feel like I should play.
Well, because I act, write, and direct, and there are other people who do the same thing, but people always ask me which I like better, and they always leave writing out because I think everyone assumes that writing is an awful job. It's a terrible grind, and no one ever recognizes writers. It's seldom. A lot of people in the audience don't even know who directed a movie. They see only the stars, let alone the writer. I mean, So, in acting, you get the most immediate response from people. They see you on the street. So, in terms of feedback, acting has changed my life in the biggest way in terms of, you know, how I'm perceived by the public. In terms of personal satisfaction and growth, you know, I've invested myself more in directing because I think it's an outlet for everything you know about stagecraft, about film and photography, about literature, about performance. You know, the director deals with a thousand separate issues on a daily basis, and you know, it's taxing and demanding in one sense, but so rewarding to operate in so many areas on so many levels all at the same time. It's a great juggling act. It's a great balancing act. It uses all your executive and management skills, you know, and all the psychology you know in dealing with people, and if you've made a good film, it's certainly rewarding.
You know, if the opportunity arose for me to direct something, I would start working on it. Shortly after, I would probably start acting again. I've never really made a decision to do either or, you know. Right now I'm going to start acting because I just finished a film. So I'll probably act for the next year or so, because after I direct, I'm usually pretty tired, and I need to regenerate myself. And acting seems to do that for me. You know.
No, I would never consider acting. It's not my gift. It's not at all my gift. I think I used to also play in rock and roll when I was a kid in bands, and there's a similarity. It's a gift of spontaneity. I think acting, playing an instrument, and it's not my gift. My gift is more to have time to think about things and construct some sort of a plan and then pursue it in a methodical sort of way. I just don't have the gift of spontaneity, and I have no intent or desire to be an actor. I don't know what my philosophy of life is. It's like treat other human beings with respect, you know, and try and act decently in this world. And as far as my films go, I think each one is it's telling what I've come to realize is what I love to do more than anything is tell a story. I think stories are very important to the human race. They help us understand how we fit into the scheme of things.
The philosophy that shows in my work is might not be reflective of real life, but it's kind of more of a wish that, you know, that people kind of discover their own innate goodness, that people find ways to integrate their personalities and identify what's really important. Someone said that the last few films I've made, probably starting with Groundhog Day, which would be Groundhog Day, Stewart Saves His Family, Multiplicity, which is a movie about a guy cloning himself. Stewart's a movie about 12-step programs, codependence and addiction. And Analyze This, wherein a gangster learns to get in touch with his grief, his rage, and anxiety, and in the process is able to renounce violence. All these movies are about, you know, how to improve the quality of our individual lives and how to integrate the self somehow. So together they represent, like I say, a wish, not necessarily a consistent philosophy. What I believe in life, it's a smattering of, you know, it's a little bit of Buddhism. I'm not disciplined enough to be real Buddhist, so I tell people I'm Buddhish, you know, a little bit Buddhish. And a lot of psychology that I've garnered both by being in therapy and having a dozen friends who practice psychotherapy in one form or another. And being Jewish and kind of Talmudic and rabbinical in my approach anyway, you know, it's kind of built into Judaism in a certain way. And having this kind of overworked sense of social justice that I got from growing up, you know, from being little and small in the 50s and coming of age in the 60s. All that just sort of swims together in my head and comes out in this kind of, you know, it might be kind of pathetic, nice guy philosophy, you know, that if, you know, at its worst, it's like, you know, it's like a bad Beatles song, you know, give peace a chance or something, but
I mean, as far as a philosophy about life, that's such a large question. I mean, I think, each day I try to I'm trying to get closer and closer to what I consider, you know, the force or the God force in the universe. I try to walk through it, you know, and feel that. I won't know I'm there until every time I walk or breathe, I feel that in everything I do, in my work, in my life, when I eat, with my kids, you know. I try to move there. That's my journey. And the storytelling is a part of me, you know. It's like breathing for me a little bit, you know. It's all one thing, you know.
Oh, geez, I'm still working on my basic philosophy of life, which is probably why I'm still writing books and making movies. So I don't have one written down yet.
You know, there's a couple of great things that I quote all the time. One is a poem by the Buddhist poet Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist priest. And he said, the miracle is not to walk on the water. The miracle is to walk on the green earth, dwelling deeply in the present moment, feeling truly alive. Which I think is a great thing about overreaching. You know, it's like, you know, you don't, and it, you know, it applies to everything we're talking about, you know, your own career goals. You don't have to work miracles, you know, just, you know, be in the moment, you know, be aware of what's going on around you, be grounded, you know. The other thing is, there's a very good Korean Buddhist teacher named Sansanim, who has a real simple philosophy. He slaps the ground and he says, don't know, only go straight for 10,000 years, save all sentient beings from suffering. So the don't know part is, you know, there's this, you've maybe heard the phrase Zen mind, beginner's mind. You know, it's about not approaching situations with preconceived ideas. A lot of people, because we're all afraid and insecure, we don't know what's really going to happen to us. Sometimes we have a very vague understanding of what's going on around us or the world. So we try to shore ourselves up with belief. You know, we get we want to have opinions. We got to have opinions. You know, I love listening to people argue about complex situations like maybe Kosovo, you know, with no more information than they got from reading the newspaper that morning. But suddenly everyone's an expert on Kosovo because you got to have an opinion, as if, you know, having an opinion is your protection against chaos somehow. But the Buddhist argument is don't know. Don't go into situations pretending you know something you don't or trying to know everything. It's a much more interesting and much more informed way to live, to just don't know. Have an open mind. Listen to everything. You know, it's something I practice. When I go into meetings, you know, I notice that everyone in the meeting is trying to have the right idea. You know, everyone wants to be recognized as the guy who knows. And particularly for a film director, it's a real temptation to want to know everything because you think you have to be in control, and we think that knowing equals control equals mastery of life somehow, you know, but it doesn't translate that way. It's important for the director to be able to say at some point, I don't know, you know, what do you think, you know? The first time I was directing a movie, the cameraman said, where do you want the camera, sir? And they call you sir like it's an insult, you know. And I said, and we were on a golf course, you know, 360 degrees, trees and grass. I said, what's the difference? Well, let's look this way. And he looks over there and he says, so do you want us to move the lunch tent and all the tables and the catering truck and the generators and, you know, the prop truck and the wardrobe truck? I said, no, let's not move that. Let's look over here. So then I learned to say, you know, instead of pretending I knew something, you know, trying to look like I was in charge, when they said, where do you want the camera? I'd say, I don't know, what do you think? So it applies like when I go to meetings, you know, this, like I was starting to say, this tendency to want to know things. I don't come in and try to dominate a meeting with what I know. I tend to listen to everyone else, you know, and then form an opinion based on the reality of the situation, not on my need to project some kind of control or dominance. It's not a competition, you know, it's I try to speak last after I've heard everyone talk, and then try to synthesize the wisest solution based on what everyone else said, and then contributing my own ideas. So don't know, you know, only go straight. 10,000 years, which means be patient. It takes my father-in-law, who was a very successful film director who passed away, a man named Danny Mann, directed 24 features, and he was a very good acting teacher and directed some very big features. He directed 3 actresses to Academy Awards. Did Come Back, Little Sheba, The Rose Tattoo, I'll Cry Tomorrow, Butterfield 8, T.S. the August Moon, a lot of, you know, Our Man Flint, you know, a succession of kind of interesting movies. He did a movie called Playing for Time with Vanessa Redgrave. He said it takes 20 years to learn anything. So it's important to be patient. You know, I think when you're trying to make a career or get something done, it could take years to get a movie off the ground. You may have to live with your greatest idea for, you know, for 10 years before it, and it may take you 20 years to master your craft to the point where people really want to use you or employ you. So I'd say, you know, 10,000 years, maybe a little long, but, you know, 20 years, it might take that long, you know.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's true that we definitely are the, you know, the primary cinematic voice in the world, you know. But we're also a very young country, you know, that has a lot of, you know, problems, emotional problems, sexual problems, philosophical problems, religious confusion. We're not a country that's based like, I mean, if there was on a scale of, if we're in India and you want to like look at kids, I mean, where we are, then they would probably be in PhDs, and we'd probably, you know, be like in elementary school, or some of the Tibetan countries, or even in the deep countries of I mean, states of China. It's totally different way of looking at life, a different way of living, which we don't reflect in our films, and sometimes I think causes a confusion as to what is really important, because we have so much affluence. And people do want to live well, no matter where they are. They want to feel like they have the food. They want to feel like they have a nice place to lay their heads. And that level of affluence that we show, I think, can be confusing to the rest of the world, because we don't tend to show the spiritual or emotional sides of life as well as some of the other films that I've seen from other countries. You know, we're a baby, you know. I mean, the United States is politically a baby. It's, what is it? I mean, a little over 200 years old. You know, I mean, there are like houses in Europe that are older than that. There are like huts in Africa that are like the caves that like make this, you know, the newest rock is older than, you know. So we have a long way to go, you know.
I think, you know, it's not only people who make stories' responsibility, it's finally everybody's responsibility. You know, when you feel like there's something germane to the story that you can do, you can put it in. I think it's very difficult to do that and have people feel like it's anything but, oh, here comes the sermon, unless you do it very well. I noticed in Lethal Weapon 2, which in every other way is really just kind of a shoot 'em up, you know, entertainment movie. They built a thing in where the daughter of one of the main characters is always on his case for eating tuna, you know, and not reading the can first. So I think there are ways that you can work that in, and just as a kind of, you know, fellow human being, you do that. And then in a much more general way, if you can get people to think and examine their lives every day and not take things for granted, I think then they become aware of things that are wrong with the world or about to become wrong with the world that they ordinarily would just kind of walk right by and say, oh, that's the way it is. If you can get people to ask the question, why? Why is it that way? And does it have to be that way? That's the start of any kind of action.
Well, I think you should get older, and you know, your financial situation is more secure. Then you start to think about responsibility. I wasn't really thinking about responsibility to the world when I made Henry. It's very difficult for me to justify, after having made Henry, to say I don't want to do this because it's too violent, or, you know, I feel it's irresponsible. And they always go, well, you're the guy that made Henry. I go, yes, but it was, you know, I mean, it was me, it was us against the world at that point, and I knew I was only going to get one chance to make a first film, and that if people didn't notice it, then I wasn't going to get another chance. So it was to make something so disturbing and so, you know, left such an impression that you couldn't possibly be unaffected or forget about having seen it. I think a little differently about it now, but again, when you're making your first film, you tend to you're not thinking in those terms about what people in another country, the last thing we were thinking of when we were making Henry was how it was going to affect people in France, or Spain, or Indonesia, or wherever in the world. But as people tend to become more moralistic as they become more secure in their economically and in their career.
When I think about my responsibility as a filmmaker, I think more about my responsibility to Americans than I do about any responsibility to the world. Although it's apparent that we are exporting our culture with, ever-increasing impact. But to the same extent, I mean, we have imported other cultures much more over the years, So I think there's, to the extent that, we all drive Japanese and German cars, a lot of us, to go to see American movies, it's appropriate that they, go see our movies in the theaters. It's more increasingly getting to be one world, but I think it's easy sometimes to just sort of generalize from most of what we see. I mean, we travel to Western Europe, we say, oh, it's just like America. It's getting more and more like America, or even places in, more exotic locations. I went to Bali and I saw Kentucky Fried Chicken in Bali. I'm sure there's a McDonald's. We know there's McDonald's in Moscow. However, people tend to forget that most of the world is not like that. 80% of the people in the world have never made a phone call. I mean, most people in the world live in much more primitive conditions. They do not live these commercialized lives of consumerism. They live lives of subsistence and survival. So, it's a kind of hubris and it's grandiose thinking to think that movies are have such a huge impact all over the world. They impact a certain segment of the world's population that fits in this narrow band that we live in. A lot of the world lives outside that narrow band and couldn't care less what Steven Spielberg is doing.
Yeah, I'd say that I'm a conscious movie maker rather than an unconscious movie maker. Even a mainstream film has a lot of political messages in it. They may just be unconscious ones because that's the status quo and that's what everybody does. And 20 years later, you may look at it and say, oh my God, how racist that movie was, or how sexist that movie was, or what they used to believe then, because it was just an unconscious movie. So I prefer to, whatever the movie is about, have it be conscious.
There's plenty of stuff I won't do. I mean, as an artist. And in fact, it's how I was able to get to the place I am in my career. I think the things that I chose not to do are some ways more relevant than some of the things I did. And, those choices made me, I think, stand apart a little bit. That I was going to do only the things that I felt, only the things I believed in. I've probably deviated from that a few times, but very rarely. And it's really guided my life. I mean, I'm hopefully guided by the way I perceive, what's good, what's right, and what's wrong. Hopefully, I have some sort of moral structure inside of me about people, some sort of caring and love about people, and the same thoughts dictate what I choose to do.
Yeah, I always try to incorporate something that I can really stand behind as a message, even though the message might be buried somewhat. The audience may see only the broadest, superficial aspect of that message, but it's there. It's always there, at least subliminally. Even in a movie like Ghostbusters, which feels frivolous on certain levels, there is kind of an inspiring message in relation to the supernatural. That it's and. This it's not worth discussing in a film class, but in some film studies program, people could examine Ghostbusters in terms of all other movies made about the supernatural, and you would find that it has a totally different approach to the supernatural. We weren't trying to scare people. We weren't trying to leave people with that feeling of nameless dread, that afraid to look in the basement because something's. We wanted to leave people with the idea that human beings, with courage, with ingenuity, can defeat any kind of supposed evil in the world, you know, and I think that's a very positive statement, you know.
I can't. It's like saying one of your children is your favorite. You know, you can't do that to them. No, you know, once I finish a picture, I don't look at it anymore. It's gone. I'm just thinking about the next. Yeah, my favorite is whatever is my next picture is my favorite until it's done. Then it's the one after that, because each of them, you know, there's none of them that I'd ever entered into making that I didn't feel I could make a really good picture. And to one degree or another, I hopefully was successful trying to achieve the initial intent of what it was to make that picture. So again, it's like children, to look back and say, I love this one and I hate that one, I just don't think works very well. I tried to make them all as good as I could, and I hope, you know, and I loved them all and equally, you know.
They're all really different. In one of the films I've done, I mean, my assistant pulled out, you know, the strap poster for me yesterday, and I remember thinking, oh, I guess that's my favorite, you know. It's been so long since I've seen it, you know. But I remember that when I was working on it, I had a great time, and you know, and everyone was kind of possessed by the energy of what we were trying to do. But Waiting to Excel was a phenomenon in its way. There's such different experiences, you know. Each one, you're just trying to create the right spirit for those people, and it's kind of hard to say, you know. But I remember feeling really free when I was doing Strapped. Even though working at HBO, you know, was just as much working for a studio as any other. I mean, they're very, very in the mix of what's going on, and have definitive opinions. And you have to fight some of the same battles that you would. But if you're working with people who are intelligent, those battles are really about opinions and trying to make the project better. If you're, and I've been lucky that most of the time that's been the case for me, you know.
It's usually the one I'm working on at the moment, because you know I have a good time working on them. So right now it's the couple that screenplays that I'm writing for new things.
We tend to favor the films we've worked on that were the most successful. So you know, I could say that my favorite films were the most rewarding ones, you know, financially and in terms of popularity. But I tend to think more of my favorite experiences making films rather than my favorite moments in the films I've made or my favorite response to the movies I've made. I've had films. I've one that's made less than $1 million. Stewart Saves His Family with Al Franken, and I think it's probably one of the better films I've made in an odd way. You know, I had a film that did very little business, made less than $20 million, called Club Paradise. I shot it in Jamaica. It was the greatest cultural experience of all the films I've made. I was in the West Indies for about 5 months. It was great. So, there are highlights to my career that don't necessarily coincide with either the best critical response or the best commercial response to the films I've worked on.
Well, what you hope is that the movies that you make or the books that you write are useful. And, I don't think anything lasts forever. You know, people say, oh, it's not chiseled in stone. Well, even stone doesn't last forever. So when I think about the future, you hope that if any of your stuff is still lying around and people pick it up and watch it or read it, that it's useful to them in some way. It may not have the same use that it had at the time that it came out. Maybe it will be historical interest, maybe it will be something else. But you hope that people read your stuff or watch it and say, oh, I can apply this somehow to the way I think about life or to the way I think about this group of people.
I'd like to be remembered for the work, though, and not for, external things.
Well, I guess the films that had the biggest impact on me growing up were films like Frank Capra films or early Marx Brothers films, and I'm sure most people are the same in that we cherish some of those early formative media experiences we've had. The early the television shows we watch in our formative years, the movies we see in our formative years, there's a kind of imprinting that happens on audience members. And I can see it in people's response to me on the street when they recognize me. I can always tell, almost guess their age by what film they mention to me. If they say Ghostbusters, it's great. I know they were about 8 years old in 1984. If they talk about Caddyshack, I know they were like 13 years old in 1980. So there's this important imprinting that happens. So I already know that a lot of the films I've worked on have imprinted themselves on great masses of people. What I would aspire to is that when we're all dead in 50 or 75 years, that whoever is keeping the archives it will still be, pulling out some of these films occasionally and looking at them as a positive example of something, or at least a funny commentary on our times.
I think work that's about the human experience. It's about feelings and life, relationships. That I told a few good stories that affected their lives. Then I'll be okay.
It's very hard to give advice to people because the one thing I've noticed is that every successful person has followed a different and unique path. There's no way to account for the kinds of accidental connections you make in life, the people you bump into, the person you happen to be sitting next to in a film class. You want to be a filmmaker, he wants to be a screenwriter. 10 years from that day you met, he's a great screenwriter, you're ready to shoot a movie, he sends you his screenplay. You can't plan that. There's no way to plan it. It's almost like you have to live your life with a certain blind confidence that if it's your destiny to succeed at these things, it will happen if you just continue to follow a straight path, to do your work as conscientiously and as creatively as you can, and to just stay open to all opportunity and experience. There's a performing motto at Second City, a couple of good ones that I've always tried to live by. One is just say yes instead of no. It's actually an improvisational rule that when someone offers something on the stage, go with it, just because it's a better human instinct to go with it rather than cutting off the dialogue or humiliating the other person or leaving them hanging out there, It's about supporting the other person. And the corollary to that is if you concentrate on making other people look good, then we all have the potential to look good. If you're just worried about yourself, how am I doing, which is kind of it's a refrain in Hollywood. People are desperately trying to make their careers in isolation, independent of everyone around them. And I've always found that my career happened it's a result of a tremendous synergy of all the talented people I've worked with, all helping each other, all connecting and reconnecting in different combinations. So, it would seem that identify talented people around you, and then instead of going into competition with them or trying to wipe them out, make alliances, make creative friendships, that allow you and your friends to grow together. Because someday your friend is going to be sitting across the desk from you running a movie studio, and he may be the one who gives you the job. And then, the simple idiot's advice I give to screenwriters who say they want to sell a screenplay is write good, Nothing sells like, a good screenplay. So part of it is, nurturing your own talent and, trying to recognize what your strengths are and playing to your own strengths too.
They need to follow their hearts and do what they really believe. Be willing to say no. If they, there have been times where even as when I did my first film, when I did Strapped, the producer was a very established producer, and I was doing my first project, but he wanted me to do something that I disagreed with, and ultimately he felt I wasn't taking his advice, and his question was, "Do you want me to leave or do you want me to stay? If you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to leave." And I said, "Well, then you should go," because he asked me. He said, "I'm here to stop you from making the mistakes that I've made." And I told him that unless I make the mistakes that then I won't learn anything. There's no reason for me to be here. And I think if that's what you're here for, then you probably should leave. There's no reason for you to be here either, And he left. And the studio was upset at me, and HBO was mad, and it kept telling me to call him and say I was sorry. And I was like, sorry about what? All I'm trying to do is tell the story I know. I'm trying to tell the story from these kids' point of view, and he wants me to do it in a different manner, and I don't understand that. I'm not making his film.
Well, I think it's just couldn't be a better time for getting started in the filmmaking business, because as we sit here, you're shooting this interview with this little Canon digital camera. I just made a little picture shot on high 8, which was then transferred. Actually, it was the output from the Avid was then transferred to, I think, Digibeta. When we did the color correction, we did it at Cutters here in Chicago, and then we took that master and took it to Sony High Def in Los Angeles, and they transferred that to high def, and then from the high def master, they transferred to 35 millimeter film. And in some ways, I think it's the most miraculous of, the miracle baby, so to speak, that it was born and that it exists, that it's a 35 millimeter print. And I think for young filmmakers now that they have these little digital cameras that produce this incredibly high quality image, that it becomes much easier for young people to get out there and make a film, especially if they're in some film school somewhere. And it doesn't have to be USC or NYU or UCLA. It can be just a little program that can afford some digital aid equipment and perhaps an Avid somewhere on premise. Work with people at your own level who are gifted, but above all, make a film. If it's 2 minutes, if it's 5 minutes, if it's 10 minutes, and then show it to people. And if you make one film, chances are almost for sure you'll make 2.
What I usually feel is that you shouldn't get caught too much in the idea of being a thing, of being a writer, of being a filmmaker, of that surface of what does a successful filmmaker look like and where do they live and those kind of things. That to me, the storytelling is what's important, the ability to be in that conversation, in that large conversation. And so if you can find a way in, even if it means you're mimeographing your own book or you're shooting on video or whatever, of course you're going to be aware of how that limits your audience, but instead of just sitting around moping and saying, oh, they're never going to give me enough to make my $5 million movie in 35, maybe that thing can be expressed in other ways first. And then maybe some fairly famous filmmakers, that will get enough notice and you'll get to remake it later in the 35 mil, version with the real budget. Anyway, thank you.
It's very hard to see the long arcing progress of your own career from where you are at any given point. But I continue to seek out ideas that allow me to make movies that are very entertaining and at the same time contain really strong messages about life. I always look for a moral, spiritual, or philosophical grounding for these ideas, because I think comedy's great and it's entertainment for its own sake. It's okay, it has a place in life. But if something can be entertaining and slightly enriching in some way, then I would always opt for that. Even movies that have historical content. I mean, at least you learn something. Even in a bad historical movie, you're going to pick up some facts, that you didn't have before. Whereas something that's made purely for entertainment's sake, what are you left with? I mean, I never see genre pictures for that reason, almost never, unless I just want to eat some popcorn, in the middle of the day and I've got nothing better to do. But I never go see mysteries to see a mystery or a love story to see a love story. There's nothing to be learned. There's nothing new that we haven't seen a million times. And some of them are very entertaining. That's fine, that's great. But I'd rather spend my time, learning something, getting some enrichment from something. As I get older, I realize that time is short, and it's harder and harder for me to spend 2 hours just wasting time in a movie theater.